Imagine holding a stick of dynamite in your hand while trying to perform delicate surgery. That is essentially what Mario Rossi was doing on a humid morning in February 1976 at the Daytona International Speedway. He wasn't just tuning a carburetor or adjusting a spoiler angle. He was engaging in a high-stakes gamble that involved hiding a pressurized explosive gas inside a suspension component that was holding the car up. If he pulled it off, he'd be a legend. If he failed, or worse, if the thing blew up, he'd be banned for life and possibly facing criminal negligence charges. This wasn't just mechanical work. This was the absolute peak of automotive outlaw engineering. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the gray areas of racing history where the rulebook gets thrown out the window. If you're someone who loves the stories of mechanical ingenuity, high-speed heists, and the golden age of cheating, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to understand the gravity of what happened that day, you have to wipe your mind clean of modern NASCAR. Forget the laser inspection stations, the sterile corporate garages, and the templated car bodies that all look identical. The 1970s were a different universe. This was the Wild West of motorsports. The rulebook was thinner than a pamphlet, and the men building these cars were World War II veterans, moonshine runners, and self-taught geniuses who looked at a regulation as nothing more than a rough suggestion. It was an era where creativity wasn't just encouraged, it was a survival trait. If you showed up to Daytona with a car that was actually legal, you were practically racing for last place. Everybody was bending the rules. The winners were just the ones who didn't get caught. But here's the thing about Daytona. It is the great equalizer and the great exposer. It's a massive 2.5-mile tri-oval where you hold the throttle wide open for almost the entire lap. There is no hiding. If you are down on horsepower, you get eaten alive. If your aerodynamics are dirty, you get left behind. In 1976, the pressure was suffocating. The prize money had skyrocketed, hitting numbers that will be worth millions today. Teams were desperate. You had legends like Richard Petty and David Pearson fighting for scraps of time, shaving fractions of a second off their laps. And then you had Dyguard Racing, a team that was hungry, aggressive, and led by a crew chief named Mario Rossi, who was about to redefine what it meant to cheat. Now, you might be thinking, okay, cheating in racing is old news. People use big engines and hidden fuel tanks all the time. And you'd be right. But what Rossi was planning was different. It wasn't brute force. It wasn't a bigger engine disguised as a smaller one. It was elegant. It was invisible. It was a masterclass in mycological manipulation as much as it was mechanical engineering. Rossi knew that inspectors looked for the obvious stuff. They checked the engine displacement. They measured the fuel lines. They looked at the intake manifold. They were looking for power where power usually comes from. Rossi decided to put the power somewhere nobody in their right mind would ever look. He decided to hide 150 horsepower inside a piece of steel tubing that was supposed to do nothing but keep the rear springs adjusted. Here's what most people don't realize about the psychology of a technical inspector. They're trained to look for patterns. If 5 teams get caught acid dipping their body panels to save weight, the inspectors start bringing ultrasonic thickness gauges to check the fenders. If someone gets caught with illegal fuel additives, the inspectors start testing fuel samples every hour. It's a reactive game. The inspector is always one step behind the innovator. Rossi knew this. He knew that to beat Bill Gazaway, the head of NASCAR inspection, and a man with eyes like a hawk, he had to put the cheating device in a place that was so mundane, so boring, and so structurally necessary that the inspector's eyes would glaze over it. He needed a component that was plain sight but invisible. Enter the wedge bar. In a stock car suspension setup, the wedge bar or weight jack bolt is just a threaded rod. It's a simple, heavy piece of steel that you turn with a wrench to adjust the preload on the rear springs. It changes how the car handles in the corners. Every single car had 2 of them. They were covered in grease, road grime, and brake dust. They were heavy, solid, and completely uninteresting. To an inspector, a wedge bar was just a piece of iron. To Mario Rossi, it was a blank canvas. It was a vessel. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Rossi realized that the dimensions of the wedge bar were roughly compatible with the volume of gas needed for a short, violent burst of extra power. If he could hollow out that bar, pressurize it with nitrous oxide, and find a way to route that gas to the engine without a single visible line, he could give his driver, the young and brash Darrell Waltrip, a secret weapon that would make his Chevrolet Monte Carlo untouchable in qualifying. Nitrous oxide, for those who don't know, is essentially chemical supercharging. It brings its own oxygen to the party. When you inject it into an engine, it splits apart under heat, releasing massive amounts of oxygen that allow you to burn more fuel instantly. It's like kicking a mule. But the engineering challenges were a nightmare. You are talking about containing pressures that could turn a steel tube into a pipe bomb if the welds failed. You are talking about routing high-pressure gas through a suspension component that moves, vibrates, and takes massive abuse at 190 miles per hour. And you have to do it all in a way that looks completely stock. There could be no extra hoses, no weird switches on the dashboard, and definitely no hissing sounds. Let's pause for a second and appreciate the audacity here. Most cheaters try to hide things in the dark corners of the car. Rossi was hiding his device in a part that the crew would be touching and adjusting in broad daylight. He was hiding it in plain sight. This is where it gets really interesting. The level of detail Rossi went to wasn't just about making it work. It was about making it look like it didn't work. He had to machine the bar from high-strength steel that looked like the cheap iron used by everyone else. He had to create a valve system that was microscopic. He had to train his driver to operate a system that didn't technically exist. The atmosphere in the garage that week was thick with paranoia. Everyone knew Dygard was up to something because the car was fast, but nobody could figure out why. The crew walked around with tight lips. Rossi was calm, almost too calm. He was playing a game of poker with the highest stakes imaginable. He knew that if Gazaway found this, his career was over. This wasn't a gray area cheat like a slightly modified bumper. This was premeditated, complex, active deception involving a banned substance. Nitrous had been explicitly outlawed for years. Bringing it onto the property was grounds for immediate expulsion. Imagine the nerves. You are Darrell Waltrip. You are strapped into a 3,800-pound missile. You know that under your seat, or rather behind you in the suspension, is a pressurized canister that your crew chief built in secret. You know that when you hit that button, the engine is going to scream like a banshee, and you have to hold onto it while doing 185 miles per hour next to a concrete wall. And you also know that as soon as you pull back into the pits, a dozen angry men in official NASCAR uniforms are going to descend on your car like vultures, looking for the reason you just went so fast. This brings us to the moment of truth. The car rolls out for qualifying. The sky is overcast, the air is cool and dense, perfect for making horsepower even without the gas. The engine fires up with that rhythmic, earth-shaking idle that only a high-compression V8 can make. Rossi stands on the pit wall, arms crossed, watching his creation roll toward the banking. He isn't watching the tires. He isn't watching the lap timer yet. He is waiting for the sound. He is waiting for that specific, distinct change in pitch that happens when the nitrous hits the cylinders and the engine note goes from a roar to a shriek. This wasn't just about speed. It was about sending a message. Rossi wanted to prove that he was smarter than the rulebook. He wanted to prove that engineering genius could overcome any regulation. But as the car accelerated out of turn 2 and onto the backstretch, Rossi's heart must have been in his throat, because once that button is pressed, there is no going back. The evidence is burned into the stopwatch. The moment Darrell Waltrip's finger pressed that radio button on the back straightaway, physics took a back seat to chemistry. You have to understand, a stock car engine at 7,800 RPM is already a chaotic environment. Pistons are changing direction hundreds of times a second, valves are slamming shut, and fuel is exploding with enough force to level a small building. It is a violent, deafening orchestration of metal and fire. But when that solenoid opened inside the wedge bar, the game changed instantly. 900 psi of liquefied nitrous oxide rushed through a stainless steel capillary tube, so thin it looked like a guitar string, and shot straight into the intake. The reaction was immediate. The engine note didn't just get louder, it hardened. It went from a deep, guttural roar to a sharp, metallic scream. Inside the cockpit, Waltrip felt the seat back compress against his spine. It wasn't the gradual pull of aerodynamic acceleration you usually feel at Daytona. It was a kick. It was violent. The tachometer needle, which usually climbs lazily at those speeds, suddenly swept upward as if the car had lost traction. But it hadn't. It had just found another 150 horsepower. Now, you might be thinking, how did nobody notice the massive burst of speed? And that is where the genius of the Daytona tri-oval comes in. Daytona is huge. You are a tiny speck on a massive asphalt canvas. From the pits, it's hard to judge pure acceleration with the naked eye when a car is half a mile away. What you see, however, is the stopwatch, and the stopwatch doesn't lie. As Waltrip tore through turn 3, fighting the wheel because the extra speed was upsetting the chassis balance, the crew on the pit wall stared at their clocks in disbelief. The car was eating up the track. It was covering ground at a rate that simply didn't make sense for a legal engine. When Waltrip crossed the start-finish line, the scoring pylon lit up, 188.91 miles per hour. That might not sound like much compared to modern speeds, but you have to look at the context. The king, Richard Petty, was struggling to hit 181. David Pearson, the Silver Fox, was wringing the neck out of his Wood Brothers Mercury and only finding 184. Waltrip hadn't just beaten them, he had embarrassed them. He was nearly 5 miles per hour faster than the field. In a sport where gains are measured in thousandths of a second, finding 5 miles per hour is like finding a way to cheat gravity. It was impossible, and that was the problem. Here's the thing about doing something impossible. It immediately paints a target on your back. If Waltrip had run 185, maybe 185.5, people would have just said, wow, Rossi really tuned that engine well. They would have grumbled, but they would have accepted it. But 188? That was a declaration of war. That was Rossi standing on the roof of the garage and shouting through a megaphone, I have something you don't have. As the car rolled down pit road, the engine idling innocently as if it hadn't just broken the laws of physics, the mood in the garage shifted from curiosity to suspicion. The other crew chiefs weren't impressed, they were angry. They knew they had been beaten, and they knew it wasn't fair. Almost immediately, the NASCAR officials descended. Bill Gazaway, the head technical inspector, didn't just walk over, he marched. He signaled for the car to be impounded immediately. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, go straight to the inspection bay. This is where the story shifts from a racing movie to a detective thriller. The car was pushed into the dark, enclosed inspection area, away from the prying eyes of the fans and the media. The doors were shut. It was just the car, the D-Guard crew, and the team of inspectors who were ready to tear that machine down to its frame rails to find the secret. Let's dig into the engineering for a second, because this is where it gets really interesting. Most people assume that cheating is about adding something obvious, like a bigger carburetor or a lighter crankshaft. But Rossi's brilliance was in the integration. He didn't just tape a nitrous bottle under the seat, he repurposed a structural component. The wedge bar he used was a masterpiece of machining. He had taken a standard bar, bored it out on a lathe to create an internal cavity, and then threaded the ends to accept the standard suspension mounts. But the walls of the tube had to be thick enough to hold 900 psi of pressure without bulging or bursting, while also supporting the entire weight of the left rear corner of the car. If that bar failed under load at 190 miles per hour, Waltrip would have hit the wall hard enough to disintegrate the car. Rossi wasn't just betting his career, he was betting his driver's life on his welding skills. The delivery system was even more impressive. You can't just run a rubber hose from the suspension to the engine. The inspectors would see it in 2 seconds. Rossi used what looked like a brake line, tucked tightly against the frame rail, covered in road grime and hidden amidst the clutter of the chassis. It ran up the firewall and entered the engine bay in a spot that was almost impossible to see unless you were looking for it with a flashlight and a mirror. And the injection point? It wasn't in the manifold. It was in the carburetor spacer plate, a flat piece of metal that sits between the carb and the engine. Rossi had drilled microscopic passages into the plate itself. From the outside, it looked like a solid block of aluminum. Inside, it was a distribution network for laughing gas. Back in the inspection bay, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Gazaway started with the basics. "Pop the hood," he ordered. They checked the carburetor. Legal. They measured the bore and stroke of the cylinders. 358 cubic inches exactly. Legal. They checked the fuel tank capacity. Legal. They even took fuel samples to send to a lab, checking for hydrazine or propylene oxide. The fuel was pure Union 76 racing gas. Nothing to see here. But Gazaway wasn't stupid. He looked at the lap times and he looked at the car, and the math didn't add up. You don't gain 50 horsepower from thin air. He knew it was there. He just couldn't see it. This is the cat and mouse game at its finest. The inspector knows you're lying, you know he knows you're lying, but until he finds the proof, you are telling the truth. Rossi stood in the corner, arms crossed, face like a stone. He offered no help. He answered questions with one-word answers. Is the timing stock? Yes. Are the heads ported? No. Hour 1 passed, then hour 2. The inspectors were getting sweaty and frustrated. They started pulling parts off the car. Off came the intake manifold. They held it up to the light, looking for hidden acid etching or illegal polishing. Nothing. They pulled the rocker covers. The valve springs were standard tension. They crawled underneath the car, banging on the frame rails with hammers, listening for the hollow thud that would indicate a hidden fuel cell. Nothing. By the third hour, the situation escalated. Bill France Jr., the czar of NASCAR, walked into the inspection bay. Now, you have to understand who Bill France Jr. was. He wasn't just an executive. He was the dictator of stock car racing. His word was law. If he said your car was illegal, it was illegal, even if the rule book said otherwise. He walked in, took one look at the dismantled Chevy, and looked straight at Mario Rossi. He didn't ask if they were cheating. He asked where they were cheating. "We aren't finding anything, Bill," Gazaway admitted, wiping grease from his forehead. "Everything measures up, but the car is too fast." France's eyes narrowed. He walked around the car slowly, like a predator circling prey. He knew the sport depended on the illusion of fair competition. If one team could break the rules this blatantly and get away with it, the whole show would collapse. He turned to his head inspector and gave an order that sent a chill down the spine of every crew member in the room. "Get the torches," France said. "We're gonna cut it apart." He didn't mean take it apart. He meant destroy it. He was threatening to take an oxy-acetylene torch and slice the chassis into pieces until they found the hidden cavity. This was a nuclear option, and this is where Rossi's poker face finally cracked, because he knew something Bill France didn't know. He knew that one of the components they might cut into was a pressurized bomb waiting to go off. This is the moment where the story pivots from a sports drama to a potential tragedy. You have to picture the scene. A garage bay lit by harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of sweat and gasoline, and a team of mechanics dragging heavy oxygen and acetylene tanks across the concrete floor. The hiss of the torch pilot light igniting cuts through the silence like a gunshot. Bill France Jr. wasn't bluffing. He was ready to turn a $50,000 race car into scrap metal just to prove a point. Mario Rossi stood there, watching the flame flicker. He was a competitive animal, a man who would do almost anything to win. But he wasn't a killer. He looked at the inspector holding the torch, then looked at the rear suspension where the wedge bar sat, loaded with 900 psi of pressurized gas. If that flame touched the steel wall of the bar, the heat would expand the gas instantly. The metal would rupture. It wouldn't just be a pop, it would be a frag grenade going off at waist height. Shrapnel would tear through the garage. People would die. Rossi took a breath, stepped forward, and dropped the facade. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He just walked up to Bill France Jr., placed the hand on his arm to lower the torch, and said 5 words that have echoed in NASCAR history ever since. "It's in the wedge bar." The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The inspectors looked at each other, confused. The wedge bar, the suspension rod, it didn't make sense. It was a solid piece of steel. It was too small to hold a fuel tank, too simple to hide a motor. France looked at Rossi with a mix of confusion and fury. "The what?" he barked. "The wedge bar," Rossi repeated, defeated. "Don't cut it. It's pressurized. That single sentence changed the energy in the room instantly. The anger evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization of what they had almost done. The mechanics quickly extinguished the torches. The inspectors backed away from the car as if it were radioactive. Under Rossi's careful instruction, they gingerly jacked up the car. They didn't treat it like a race car anymore, they treated it like unexploded ordnance. They unbolted the suspension links. When they finally pulled the heavy steel bar out of the chassis, it looked normal. That was the infuriating brilliance of it. It was covered in grease. It had the right weight heft to it. But when Rossi showed them the hidden valve, a tiny, almost invisible pinhole that looked like a casting flaw, the inspectors finally understood. They carefully bled the pressure. A long, cold hiss of nitrous oxide escaped into the garage, freezing the moisture in the air as it expanded. The smoking gun was literally smoking with cold vapor. Here's what most people don't realize about this moment. It wasn't just that they found the cheat, it was that they were forced to admire it. Bill France Jr. was furious, absolutely livid that his sport had been made a mockery of. But even he, the stern disciplinarian, had to stare at that device and shake his head. It was a masterpiece. It was a Swiss watch hidden inside a sledgehammer. The machining was aerospace grade. The internal walls were perfectly consistent to handle the pressure. The release mechanism was wired into the radio button, a stroke of genius that meant the driver could trigger it without taking his hands off the wheel or looking suspicious. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Darrell Waltrip's pole-winning time was thrown out. The car was disqualified. The team was slapped with a $7,500 fine. Now, you might be thinking, $7,000? That's nothing. But in 1976, that was the equivalent of nearly $40,000 today. It was a massive hit for a racing team. Rossi was suspended indefinitely, though that was later reduced to a few months. But the real punishment wasn't the fine or the suspension. It was the legacy. You see, up until that day, the NASCAR rulebook was a list of don'ts. Don't make the engine bigger than this. Don't use this fuel. Don't lighten the frame. It was a blacklist. Rossi's Wedge Bar broke the system because it wasn't technically on the list. There was no rule that said, do not fill suspension components with laughing gas, because nobody had ever been crazy enough to dream it up. Rossi had exploited a loophole the size of a molecule. Because of this single device, NASCAR had to completely rewrite its philosophy on policing the sport. They introduced the catch-all rule that is still infamous today: actions detrimental to stock car racing. It basically gave NASCAR the power to ban anything they didn't like, even if it wasn't explicitly written down. If they felt you were violating the spirit of the competition, they could hammer you. That rule exists because of Mario Rossi. He forced the sport to grow up. He forced the inspectors to stop looking for what was there and start imagining what could be there. But let's look deeper at the mechanism itself, because the devil is in the details. The switch wasn't just a button. Rossi had wired a solenoid, an electromagnetic switch inside the frame rail. When Darrell Waltrip pressed a radio button, it completed a circuit that opened the valve on the wedge bar. But here's the kicker: the circuit was only live when the transmission was in fourth gear. Why? To prevent an accidental discharge in the pits or on a caution lap. If Darrell Waltrip hit the radio button while idling, nothing happened. It was only when the car was at race speed that the weapon became active. That is a level of fail-safe engineering that you see in military aircraft, not redneck racing. And the plumbing? The line that ran from the bar to the engine was a capillary tube. It was so thin that it could be hidden inside the braided steel shielding of a brake line. To an inspector looking at the brake system, it just looked like a standard flex hose. But inside that hose was a second, smaller tube carrying the nitrous. It was a Russian nesting doll of deception. The discovery of the Wedge Bar sent shockwaves through the paddock. Other crew chiefs didn't shun Rossi. They studied him. They realized that the era of brute force cheating was over. You couldn't just build a bigger engine anymore. You had to be a magician. You had to be a smuggler. The Wedge Bar incident kicked off a golden age of creative cheating that lasted well into the 1990s. We saw teams filling roll cage bars with lead shot that they could release during the race to lower the car's weight. We saw trapdoor floorboards that would suck the car down to the track for better aerodynamics. We saw fuel lines that held 3 gallons of gas just in the tubing itself. But none of them, not one, had the sheer elegance of the Wedge Bar. The irony of the whole situation is that the device itself was saved. Usually, NASCAR destroys illegal parts. They crush them, melt them down, or bury them to prevent teams from getting them back. But the Wedge Bar was different. Bill France Jr. kept it. He put it in his office. For years, it sat on a shelf, a silent reminder of the day he almost blew himself up, and the tribute to the ingenuity of the man who tried to fool him. Today, that very bar sits in the NASCAR Hall of Fame archives. It is a relic, a holy grail of the dark arts. As the 1976 Daytona 500 approached, Dyguard Racing was in shambles. They had to rebuild the car to pass a new rigorous inspection. They had to race without their star crew chief. Waltrip had to start from the back of the field, his magical horsepower advantage gone. The car was still fast, it was a good car even without the gas, but it wasn't supernatural anymore. The race was won by David Pearson and one of the most famous finishes in history, crashing across the line with Richard Petty. But in the garages, nobody was talking about the finish. They were talking about the start. They were talking about the ghost in the machine. This is where it gets really interesting for us as modern enthusiasts. We look at this story and we smile. We root for Rossi. Why? Because there is something deeply human about trying to outsmart the system. We love the heist movie. We love the guy who counts cards at the casino. Rossi wasn't hurting anyone. Well, except for the explosion risk, which he prevented. He was just trying to solve a problem. How do I go faster than everyone else? The rulebook was just an obstacle, like air resistance or friction. It was a variable to be managed, not a law to be obeyed. But the story doesn't end in 1976. The legacy of the Wedge Bar is visible in every modern F1 car, every Le Mans prototype, and every Cup car today. It created a culture of paranoia that drives the sport forward. Today's inspectors use laser scanners that can detect a deviation of 1/1000th of an inch. They use templates that fit over the car like a glove. They have computers that analyze engine telemetry in real time. And why? Because they know that somewhere in some garage, there is a kid like Mario Rossi looking at that laser scanner and thinking, I bet I can beat that. This brings us to the aftermath, and honestly, this is where the story turns into a full-blown espionage thriller. You might think that after seeing a man nearly get banned for life, the other teams would straighten up and fly right. You might think they'd look at the Wedge Bar incident and say, okay, that's too risky. Let's just build legal cars. If you think that, you don't understand racers. Mario Rossi didn't stop cheating. He just inspired everyone else to cheat better. The Wedge Bar incident was like the moment the sound barrier was broken. Once people knew it was possible to hide a complex system inside a mundane part, the floodgates opened. It kicked off an arms race of engineering subterfuge that makes the Cold War look like a playground squabble. The garage area became a laboratory of deception. If Mario Rossi could hide a nitrous system in a suspension tube, what else could be hidden? And more importantly, where else were the inspectors not looking? Let's talk about the lead shot special. This is the direct spiritual successor to the Wedge Bar, and it is just as brilliant. In racing, weight is the enemy. You want the car to be as light as possible to accelerate fast, but NASCAR has a minimum weight rule, let's say 3,700 pounds, to keep things fair. Usually, if a car is too light, teams bolt blocks of tungsten or lead to the frame rails to bring it up to spec. But smart crew chiefs realize that where you put that weight matters. You want it low and to the left to help the car turn. So, inspired by Rossi's use of hollow tubes, teams started looking at the roll cage. It's made of massive steel tubing. It's hollow and it's everywhere. A team, and we won't name names, but you can guess the usual suspects, figured out a way to fill the frame rails with lead shot. I'm talking about the tiny little pellets you use in a shotgun shell. They would pour hundreds of pounds of this stuff into the hollow frame rails before the race. When the car went through inspection, it weighed exactly 3,700 pounds. Perfect. Legal. But here's the trick. They installed a trap door in the bottom of the frame rail, controlled by a cable in the cockpit. On the parade laps, before the green flag even dropped, the driver would pull the cable. The trapdoor would open, and hundreds of pounds of lead shot would pour out onto the track, bouncing away into the grass like harmless pebbles. By the time the green flag waved, the car was 300 pounds lighter than everyone else. It was a rocket ship. The only reason they eventually got caught was because a driver pulled the handle too early in the pits, and a NASCAR official literally slipped on the rolling lead balls like a cartoon character. This is the legacy of the Wedge Bar. It taught mechanics that the car itself was a container for secrets. It shifted the focus from the engine to the chassis. And this evolution of cheating tells us something profound about the sport. In the 1950s, cheating was crude, boring out cylinders. In the 70s, with Rossi, it became mechanical, hidden devices. But as we moved into the 80s and 90s, largely because of the paranoia Rossi instilled, cheating became aerodynamic. If you can't hide a nitrous bottle because the inspectors are now tearing suspension parts apart, you hide the air itself. You manipulate the invisible. Let's look at the infamous T-Rex car of 1997. This was a Chevrolet Monte Carlo built for Jeff Gordon by a genius engineer named Rex Stumpf. Now, Rex didn't use nitrous. He didn't use trapdoors. He did something much more dangerous. He read the rulebook. He read every single line of the NASCAR rulebook and found every single thing they didn't say. The rulebook said the car had to be a certain width. It didn't say the bottom of the car had to be flat. So Rex redesigned the entire underbody to create a ground effect vacuum that sucked the car to the track. The rulebook said the suspension had to use certain parts. It didn't say you couldn't fundamentally alter the geometry of how those parts connected to create a passive rear steering effect. When the T-Rex car showed up at the All-Star race, it was a spaceship. Jeff Gordon didn't just win, he dominated so effortlessly that it looked like he was playing a video game on easy mode. After the race, the inspectors did exactly what they did to Rossi. They tore the car apart. They measured everything. And guess what? It was 100% legal. It complied with every single letter of the law. But it was so advanced, so radically superior, that NASCAR officials were terrified. They didn't disqualify the car. They didn't fine the team. They simply told the crew chief, Ray Everham, don't ever bring this car back. They banned it not because it broke the rules, but because it proved the rules were broken. That is the Rossi effect. It's the fear that someone, somewhere, is smarter than the regulations. This constant cat-and-mouse game drives the technology forward. You have to realize that these crew chiefs are not criminals. They are untapped engineering geniuses. If Mario Rossi had worked for NASA, he probably would have figured out a way to get to Mars on half a tank of fuel. The constraints of racing, the tight box of rules, force a level of creativity that you don't see in open engineering. When you tell a brilliant mind, you can do anything except X, they will spend every waking hour figuring out how to do X adjacent. And this brings us to a controversial point. Is cheating good for the sport? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should let everyone use nitrous. That would be dangerous and chaotic. But there is a charm to the attempt. There is a romance to the outlaw. When we hear the story of the Wedge Bar, we don't think, man, that Rossi guy was a dishonest jerk. We think, that was awesome. We admire the hustle. We admire the fact that he cared so much about winning that he was willing to reinvent the car to do it. Compare that to modern racing. Today, if a car is illegal, it's usually because a laser scan found that a rear spoiler was 0.001 inches too high due to thermal expansion. It's a technicality. It's boring. There's no story there. Nobody sits around a campfire and tells the legend of the slightly out-of-spec rear toe alignment of 2024. But we will be telling the story of the Nitrous Wedge Bar for another 100 years. Why? Because it required human agency. It required a decision. It wasn't a manufacturing error. It was a heist. The wedge bar also highlights the specific relationship between the mechanic and the machine. Rossi looked at a wedge bar and saw a potential that nobody else saw. To everyone else, it was a solid stick. To him, it was empty space waiting to be filled. That is a specific type of vision. It's the same vision that led Smokey Yunick to build a fuel line that was 11 feet long and 2 inches wide so it could hold 5 gallons of gas. It's the same vision that led teams to soak their tires in secret chemicals to soften the rubber for more grip, only to have the tires dissolve halfway through the race. It's the vision of the racer's edge. And in 1976, that edge was razor thin. You have to remember the context of the era. This was before data acquisition. They didn't have laptops plugged into the cars. They didn't have sensors on the suspension. Rossi couldn't look at a graph to see if the nitrous was working. He had to rely on his driver's feedback and the seat of his pants. He had to calculate the flow rate of the gas using pencil and paper, estimating the pressure drop over time. If he got the math wrong, he would have melted the pistons. A lean condition with nitrous is catastrophic. It turns the inside of your engine into a blast furnace. The fact that the engine survived the qualifying run is a testament to his tuning ability as much as his fabrication skills. So, where does that leave us? We have a banned mechanic, a disqualified car, and the rulebook that had to be rewritten. But we also have a turning point. Before 1976, NASCAR was a regional sport trying to go national. It was still shedding its bootlegger image. But stories like this, stories of high-tech deception, actually helped legitimize the sport in a weird way. It proved that these weren't just hillbillies driving in circles. These were sophisticated technical operations. The wedge bar proved that NASCAR was a battle of wits, not just a battle of bravery. Let's play a quick game of what if. Imagine for a second that Mario Rossi had been a different kind of man. Imagine he was more selfish, or perhaps just more panicked. Imagine he stood there in that inspection bay, watched Bill France Jr. order the torches to be lit, and said nothing. He could have gambled that the cutter would start on the front suspension or the frame rails and maybe give up before reaching the rear. He could have walked out of the room. If that torch had touched the wedge bar, the resulting explosion would have likely killed the mechanic holding the torch and possibly Bill France Jr. himself. It would have leveled the inspection bay. We wouldn't be talking about a legendary cheat today. We would be talking about the Daytona tragedy of '76. NASCAR might have been sued into oblivion. The sport as we know it might have ceased to exist under the weight of wrongful death lawsuits and safety violations. In that split second, Rossi didn't just save a few lives. He potentially saved the entire future of American stock car racing. That is the burden he carried in that silence. He chose the death of his career over the death of his peers, and there is honor in that, even if it was born from deceit. That specific wedge bar now sits in the NASCAR Hall of Fame in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's not in the center of the room with a spotlight on it. It's tucked away, a quiet artifact in a glass case. Most people walk right past it. They see a rusty, greasy metal tube and keep walking toward the shiny cars and the trophies. But if you stop and look closely, you can see the hole. You can see the tiny precision-drilled port that Rossi made with his own hands. It looks innocuous. It looks like nothing. But that piece of metal represents the absolute apex of the analog era. It is the Excalibur of cheating. When you look at that bar, you aren't just seeing a car part. You are seeing a physical manifestation of the racer's mindset. It is a reminder that the rulebook is a living document, constantly being rewritten by the people who break it. Every rule in NASCAR exists because someone, at some point, did something so smart and so unfair that they had to write a law to stop it from happening again. Rossi's name isn't on the trophy for the 1976 Daytona 500, but his signature is written in invisible ink on every page of the rulebook that followed. Today, the spirit of Mario Rossi is harder to find, but it's still there. It's just gone digital. The modern crew chief isn't using a lathe to hollow out suspension parts. He is using code. He is finding gray areas in the engine mapping software. He is using simulation tools to find aerodynamic gains that are invisible to the naked eye, but obvious to the wind. The cheats of today are sterile. They are hidden in lines of data, not in steel tubes. And while that is technically impressive, it lacks the visceral, tactile danger of what Rossi did. There is no risk of a laptop exploding if you get caught. There is no physical evidence you can hold in your hand and say, "Look at this beautiful lie." We live in an era of transparency. Everything is measured, recorded, and analyzed. The mystery is gone. But stories like this, the legend of the Nitrous Wedge Bar, remind us of a time when the garage was a sanctuary of secrets. They remind us that, at its core, racing is not about following rules. It is about speed. Pure, unadulterated, uncompromising speed. And sometimes the only way to find that speed is to step off the path, walk into the dark, and build something that nobody else is brave enough to build. Rossi proved that you don't need $1 million to beat the factory teams. You don't need a wind tunnel. You just need a better idea. You need the audacity to look at the world not as it is, but as it could be if you just tweaked it a little bit. That is the lesson here. It's not about breaking the law. It's about questioning the boundaries. It's about looking at a constraint and asking, is this a wall or is this a door? For Mario Rossi, the Wedge Bar was a door. He walked through it, and for 2 glorious laps at Daytona, he was the fastest man on earth. So, the next time you watch a race and see a car get disqualified for failing inspection, don't just shake your head. Smile, because it means the spirit is still alive. It means someone is still out there pushing against the walls, trying to find that unfair advantage. It means the ghost of Mario Rossi is still haunting the garage, whispering into the ears of young engineers, "I bet you could hide it in there." And honestly, I hope they never stop trying, because a racing series without cheaters is just a parade. The cheaters keep us honest. The cheaters make us faster. The cheaters are the ones who force us to look closer, to think deeper, and to dream bigger. They are the villains we need and the heroes we secretly want to be. This is Legacy Motoring. I hope this deep dive into the mechanical underworld gave you a new appreciation for the dark arts of racing. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the most ingenious cheat in NASCAR history, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below telling me your favorite racing controversy. Was it the T-Rex car, Smokey's fuel line, or maybe something we haven't even discovered yet? I read every single comment, and I want to know what you think. Does innovation excuse rule breaking, or should the book be the law? Let's argue about it in the comments. Until next time, keep your eyes on the rulebook, but keep your mind on the gray areas, because that is where the magic happens. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.